Thank you for coming tonight. Appreciate you. There's a kind of a place to sign in for giveaways back there. There's 3 T-shirts and a hat. So I'll do that at the end. And I'm going to start a little early just because I want to make a couple pitches here. One, the Oklahoma Military Heritage Foundation is a group that does a really good job of maintaining Oklahoma military heritage. Go figure, it's in the name. In fact, at the end of the month, they have a Hall of Fame banquet where they're going to induct Oklahomans based on their military record. There's some people that receive that posthumously. They do an outstanding job of maintaining our heritage. And one of the things they do is this kiosk and website. The kiosk is now at the Oklahoma History Center of everybody that's ever been inducted into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. And it's simple, right? It's real simple. You can go in there, look at the database, get the bios. There's some sketches and videos of inductees that they've had interviews with. It's really outstanding. So if you ever want to get kind of connected with your Oklahoma military heritage, that's a great place to go. And of course, the Oklahoma History Center is outstanding as well. And one of the reasons that I've been doing this, I did this last fall, and one of the reasons I've been doing this is to kind of bring some awareness around veterans organizations. So Mission 22, their mission statement, Veterans, Family, Community, we average around 22 veterans that commit suicide a day. I think that's horrible. I think any suicide is horrible. But that particular demographic has some stuff that they've got to work through. And so that organization helps with that. And so does Till Valhalla. So Till Valhalla was started by some veterans, and they just sell merchandise. In fact, I've got one of their T-shirts up here, some of their stuff. They've got some pretty good stuff. And what they do is they sell the merchandise and then use that money to go out and provide therapy, different kinds of therapy and for veterans. And then they also will do plaques and memorials for veterans that pass. So they will specifically go out to families that are hurting and help them. And that is probably some older stats. I'm sure it's more than that now, but they do an outstanding job. And so as we get ready to do this and we get ready to talk, I always try to, put a little lean in on those organizations, and I would encourage you to know more about your military heritage, whether it's in your family or your community, and then know there's a bunch of veterans around you. Some of them are hurting, so those are ways to help them. All right, so I should have introduced myself to begin with. So my name's Greg Kent. I retired as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. Spent over 20 years, and I've primarily flew AWACS. And so you're going to get to see something kind of ironic, is you're going to have an Air Force aviator talking about Navy submarines tonight, right? That just doesn't happen, okay? It's pretty bizarre, actually. But what I like to do is take a topic and start pulling it apart. History is like, it's kind of like a good rack of ribs, okay? You got to pull it apart to see what you got. Okay, and this one is going to be very much that way, and you'll see. Normally, what I like to do is people, go through a bio of people. Tonight, we're going to talk about an event. All right, who's read or watched the movie The Hunt for Red October? Anybody? Okay, pretty much old people. Okay, young people. This is an outstanding movie. It's really, really good. Okay. It's kind of this Cold War thriller, if you will, and it was written by Tom Clancy, and he talks about this rogue Soviet submarine captain, right? And you don't really know how it's going to work out, and it was published, interestingly enough, by the Navy Institute. Weird that they would be publishing a fictional book, but it was published in 1984. It sold 4.6 million copies. Instant hit. So then they decided to do a film, and the film budget was $30 million, which by today's standards is really not that much. But it grossed $200 million. Okay? So that's a 6.x on your investment. That's pretty good. So you know that in the box office when it came out, it's resonating with people. It's resonating with people. And it's funny because this was a quote from Tom Clancy. He said, I've made up stuff that's turned out to be real, and that's the spooky part. And that's Tom Clancy. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Stuff that you think would probably be fiction and made up, but it's not. Now, to set this stage, let's talk about the Cold War. It was interesting. I was talking to Nick just a little bit ago. We don't talk about the Cold War. Usually, especially in history class, you're probably going to talk about the Civil War. You might talk about World War II and certain aspects of it, but generally, we don't talk about the Cold War. But it ran from 1947, okay, 1947 is when the Russians exploded their first atomic weapon, to 1991, okay? And it's this weird geopolitical struggle that occurs between the United States and the Soviet Union, back and forth, back and forth. And really what it was about is very two diametrically opposed worldviews. It gets down to worldviews, okay? The United States was supported by the West. That was mainly your capitalistic, liberal democracies, West Europe, Canada, mainly those. And then the USSR, the Soviet Union, was supported by what was called the East. So you had the West versus the East. And that was more your second world, more what I call a command economy. What that means is the state controlled everything. You didn't decide if you wanted to go work somewhere. They told you where you were going to go work. And it was all focused at the highest level within the state. The state reigned supreme. As opposed to us, if we decide, hey, I want to start a business today, you can do that, okay? And you can hustle, and then you receive the rewards of whatever hard work you put in. That was not what was happening in the Soviet Union. But there was no what I would call large-scale military engagement between the two sides, and there was this weird balance that was struck across what's called mutually assured destruction. MAD, okay? M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. And what that was is that was all the politicians' view of how to keep people from actually destroying one another. So you had to have parity in nuclear weapons because you said that if this person struck first, if one struck first, the other one would respond and everybody would be destroyed. So that was mutually assured destruction. And that existed from 1947 pretty much to 1991. We existed under that envelope. Now, just going through a couple things just to set the stage, because when you talk about events don't occur in a vacuum. They're the result of all sorts of other things that occur around them. Same way with the people that are involved. Those people respond based on their experience, okay? So we have this thing called the Berlin Airlift. The Soviet Union blockaded Berlin at the end of World War II. And there was in West Berlin, there was the Allies, and then they controlled everything else, and they wouldn't let any food in. Food, coal, nothing. And so the United States Air Force said, well, we got to get something to them, right? And so we airlifted and kept West Berlin alive from June of 1948 to May of 1949, particularly through that winter. So everything that city needed came by air. And you can do more research on that. The other thing that then happened is in August of 49, the Soviet Union got their first atomic bomb, and that blew people's minds. That was not supposed to be a pun. Thank you for whoever laughed at that. Because they weren't supposed to get it at all. They were probably 5 to 10 years early. We find out later is they were getting some information out of our nuclear weapons programs. So that was in the 40s. Then you go to the 50s, so the United States goes, okay, you have a nuke. Well, I'm going to get a bigger nuke. And so we do our first thermonuclear bomb November of 1952. And the Soviets then kind of start responding, and they go, well, great. Well, I'm going to put up Sputnik. Now, by the way, these are like my top, 10. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that's all happening along in here. And you won't hear me talk about China right here, right now. But the point being is they put Sputnik up. Again, that rattled people to the core. At no point had anything ever circled the globe, right? There was a Soviet, a Russian satellite going right over the United States, and people were digging bomb shelters. They thought the war was coming to them right now. The Korean War kicks off in 1950 to 1953. Again, I'll let you do your own research on that. And then the Vietnam War actually kicks off in 1959. And most of the time we don't talk about that, but we were in South Vietnam supporting the South Vietnamese government in 1949 with advisors. So what you're watching is this back and forth, maneuver, counter maneuver, okay? And then leading up into the late 60s, the Berlin Wall gets constructed in about 3 weeks. The Soviet Union laid down a wall. And it wasn't to keep people out. It was to keep people in. Because anybody that was in East Berlin walking back and forth was like, I don't want to be here anymore. We're out. And they'd try to get to West Berlin and then emigrate to the West. Well, the Soviet Union finally had enough of that. This is Khrushchev. And it had enough of that, so they just put up a wall. Started with a bunch of barbed wire, and then they reinforced it with cement. And it had split the city in half. And then it kept going. So you couldn't get out of East Berlin. You were stuck. And it would go right down the alley between two buildings. And that became a pinch point between the West and the East. The Soviet Union then decides they pop off the largest thermonuclear bomb ever produced. Okay? We called it the Tsar Bomba. Dark humor. In October of 1961. And that's where they stopped. And everybody stopped. Because I'll let you go look that up on your own, but the effects of that particular bomb were felt, 50 miles away from the center. It was a true, like, city country killer. And then this thing kicks off now, right, where you have this Cuban Missile Crisis that occurs in October of 1962. If you don't know what that is, the Russians, Soviets, put ballistic missiles in Cuba. Now, if you're living in Miami, that concerns you because your time to react to something like that would have been minutes, okay? Minutes. And so this is where John F. Kennedy says, no, and we put up a blockade, and Khrushchev, who was the premier for the Soviet Union, ends up backing down. And there's a great study about that. There's a great movie with Kevin Costner about that. And it goes into what the UN is there to do. The UN does what it's supposed to do, and everybody kind of backs away from deciding to start throwing stuff at each other. But it came very, very close. And again, back in the day, people were building bomb shelters in their backyards. In fact, old people, like you can remember probably like where there would be fallout shelters. Like New York City had fallout shelters. There'd be this little nuclear sign on the side of the building, and that was where it was already stocked with canned food, where if you suddenly came under an air raid and you got warned, everybody was supposed to go to that building. We haven't lived under that for 60, 70 years. Like younger people, you don't know anything like that. The closest thing I can probably currently would be like Kyiv, Jerusalem, where they live under that on a daily basis. So that's all the stuff that's leading up. Now, as we get going, again, Cold War, we're not going to do international relations in the time we've got because we've got a lot of things to cover. But generally speaking, when we start going fast through this, there's four instruments of national power that you should see when you go into scenarios, right? There's diplomatic, right? That's all your ambassadors. There's informational. That makes sense, right? Propaganda, newspapers, trying to understand what's going on. Military and economic. Those are your primary four, and intelligence covers all of those. And there's these weird mechanisms that reinforce those instruments, like technology. Like the instruments of national power don't generally change, but the way you use them and can adapt to them change. So technology, propaganda, like social media, and then proxies doing your work for you, basically, is what happens. And you see that. Now, I'm sharing that with you because here comes the Soviet missile boat K-129. It was built in 1958. It was a diesel sub, which meant It would be on the surface or just below the surface, running diesel with a snorkel, and then it would charge its batteries, and then the snorkel would retract, and they would go underwater and run off batteries. But they had to keep charging those batteries, okay? It had 3 2,000 horsepower engines, so it could move pretty good, and it had a range of over about 22,000 miles. That's pretty good range, okay? And it had 3 intercontinental submarine launch ballistic missiles. And it was able to launch submerged. So think about that. You can't even see them coming. They are submerged. You look out across the placid waters of the Pacific, and all of a sudden, something just pops out of the ocean and starts flying. Very, very hard to detect. And it also had 16 torpedoes, of which it had 2 special ones. Special means nuke. Okay? These guys were carrying these every day. Those torpedoes were meant to go into like a harbor, right? Or if they were getting, like if you were in the middle of a flotilla, you could put one of those in the middle of an aircraft carrier group, and you'd blow it up. Okay? Standard operating. And here's what it looks like. Okay? And you see those black tubes? That's where the missiles were. Okay? And then you see the black tubes to the right. There's your torpedoes, and you can kind of see where everybody's at. Really important. You see where the ship's bell is? See that arrow right there? That's going to become important. Okay. Carried a 1 megaton nuclear warhead. Each missile had 1 megaton, right? So that was about 65 times the power of what was put on Nagasaki. For just general comparison. So it meant business. Okay? It meant business. Now, here's their skipper. Now, this Iowa farm boy doesn't speak Russian. Okay? So if there's any Russian linguists in here and I start mispronouncing Russian, you can correct me later. But this is the skipper, Vladimir Kobzar. 38, he's Ukrainian. Ironic to today, he's Ukrainian. But he's way smart because he graduates from Sevastopol Higher Naval Engineering School. He's married, 2 children, 16-year-old daughter, 8-year-old son. He was supposed to be running his final mission. He's on his way to higher headquarters, okay? But he's been awarded the Order of the Red Star for excellent service, but it's a state secret as to what that service was. Depending on when you start picking through it, what you find out is he parked himself off the U.S. territorial waters and ran missile drills, probably off of California or Washington. Crew loves him. They like him. And this is his second in command. This is Alexander Zarovin, okay? Now, he, 34, he's got a 12-year-old son. He's second in command, but he's also Leningrad Naval Academy. These guys are the best the Soviet Union has to offer, and they were selected by the state, plucked. These guys are true believers, okay? They are all about the state, the communist state. He'd served over more than a year with Captain Kobzar. He's known as being good-natured. He actually went fishing. He'd go fishing with the enlisted guys off the sub when it was surfaced. They thought it was important that we know that. But he's supposed to be K-129's next skipper, right? So he's also a true believer. And then here's a bunch of the crew, okay? And we know this. And this is going to become important in a little bit. Like, we know it. I don't have pictures of them all. There are pictures out there. But there's all the crew. And then here are all the enlisted guys. So there's 14 officers, 3 warrant officers, 6 chief petty officers, 24 petty officers, 48 seamen. You got the total of 85 crew on that small submarine. Okay? In fact, Zarovin is right there in the middle on the right, hanging out with the guys. And they work out of that little circle right there is the base Rabici submarine pens, right? That's where they're working out of. It had just completed a 2-month combat patrol in the northeast Pacific. Northeast meaning off of our coast. That's Alaska. So he was on a combat patrol near Hawaii, California, Oregon, Washington. And when they get back, the crew splits, right? Because they're literally underwater for 2 months in a tube. Okay? So when they get back to port, man, they're done, right? Half stay. They start cleaning up the sub for the next go round. The other half go on holiday. So they start cleaning the sub up. But then in February of 1968, something weird happens. The Soviet Navy orders K-129 back to sea way, way early. Now, the Soviets do things very methodically, okay? Not a lot of what I'll call creative thinking, okay? They don't do audibles, okay, at all. It's very, very strict. And so all of a sudden, the Central Command orders all that crew to report back between 5 and 8 February. Broke everybody's PTO. I'm sure that PTO means paid time off or leave. I'm sure everybody was incredibly excited. Wives were happy because they were all on holiday. Kids were happy. Everybody was excited that their husbands were going back to the ship. But what's weird about this is Admiral Dagallo complains. Soviets don't complain. But he goes to the 15th Squadron Commander and he puts it in writing. This is wrong. Does it but they're like, yeah, noted, thanks, appreciate it, keep going. He goes so far as then to jump his immediate boss to the fleet commander, and his response comes back and says, this order comes from the Supreme Commander. So he's jumped, right? You just don't jump chain of command. And at the same time, what's happening is the North Koreans have seized a U.S. boat, and the North Vietnamese have started the Tet Offensive. Just all what you need to take away from that is there's a lot going on in the Western Pacific Ocean at that point. A lot. They skip all the routine maintenance. They just do the stuff that's absolutely necessary. They load up food and medical supplies for 87 crew members, and they get 3 freshly fueled missiles. And then all of a sudden, the day before they put in, they get 11 crew members out of nowhere that are told to board the boat. They arrived at the pier with the orders assignment. There was 9 seamen, 1 seaman first class, and 1 chief petty officer. But they only have rations and bunking for 85 guys. So they've just added 2 extra ones and then 11 more. What was weird about this, when you read the history, is these guys kept to themselves. Submarine people, close community, they spend a lot of time with one another. It's kind of like when AWACS, like Colonel Bushlam and I will get together and we'll go, hey, you remember back in the day with the thing? Like, there's this camaraderie that builds in but none of that was happening here. That's a picture of K-129 right there. Okay, so 24 February, Vice Admiral Glossov, he's the commander, delivers sealed orders, says to be opened on the 3rd day after leaving base. So you don't even know where you're going. You just head out, here's your orders, they're sealed. That's kind of normal, right? And they're expecting 14 days of radio silence. So the Russians, they're not checking in on the radio at all. And they're to return to port on 5 May of 1968. They set sail at midnight from Rabachi, and they do it in the middle of the night because it's easier to hide, right? And by 0100 hours, they'd already done their test dive. Everything's good. Ship's operating. We're good to go. Talk to you in 14 days. And so they're operating between 100 and 200 submerged with diesel power. So what they're doing is they're snorkeling up, getting fresh air from above to run their diesels to power up their batteries. And here's the cool thing. We knew it. So we have this thing called SOSUS that's tracking all of it. They don't know that. We know it. And we had caught them up on our submarine patrols as well. So on 1 March, okay, so they've set in, 24 Feb, they're out in the ocean. They don't call in on 1 March that they had crossed the international date line. Highly unusual, but they've been told to go radio silent for 14 days, so nobody thought anything about it. On 4 March, they start moving outside their normal mission patrol box, and on 8 March, they fail to actually transmit mandatory message that they were on station and starting patrol. So now they're missing their calls. Here's the deal, like I just said, Russians, particularly Russian submarines, captains, don't do random at all. So on 12 March, the headquarters now is starting to send out signals to them to say, hey, you need to report in. Don't get anything back. On 17 March, a more urgent, like, hey, we were urgent, but now we're really urgent. Like, you guys need to call in. We need to know where you're at. What's going on? And all of a sudden, you have all of this kick loose. Let's see. right here, where they commence on the 21st of March, they commence a huge search and rescue operation, okay, covering about 854,000 miles of ocean, open ocean. 4 subs immediately race out of Rabici. They're all being tracked by that, which is the USS Barb. The USS Barb is watching this, and he's picking up. He's a spy sub. He's picking all these transmissions in the open. Again, very unusual for the subs. Red Star come in, not getting any response. And so what you see here is this is the point where they think they should be. Right there's their patrol box, and you can kind of see. Right, that's not letting me do it. Yeah, right there where Pearl Harbor is. Right, that's where they're at. That's where they're supposed to be at. Then 36 flag vessels participate day and night. They're out. So the entire Soviet Pacific Fleet is going after, looking for this sub, wondering what happened. 53 aircraft participate, including the one on the right there is the TU, the Tupolev 16 Badger. That's a bomber. So they're flying bombers over U.S. Navy assets out in the middle of the Pacific trying to find their boat. The Tu-95, which is on the right, which is a prop, that's the Bear bomber, Tupolev 95, they're still flying those up against Alaska right now. Like if you look that up on Google, that we just had an intercept with an F-16 intercept those. Those are nukes. They're nuclear bombers, and they play games. And so they ended up over the next, they're out there for 73 days trying to find this boat. On 5 May, they're gone. Everybody's presumed lost. Okay? There's Admiral DeGallo. He actually suffers a heart attack, writing personal letters to all the families. And then it says, this is what his quote is: by the order of the Ministry of Defense, K-129 was removed from the register of naval vessels as though it never existed. Moscow decided that it was the end of the story. Boop, done. We lost the sub. That's it. But it's not. The official Soviet Navy hypothesis was that while it was operating in snorkel mode, I said that was diesels, it was doing snorkeling, that somehow it basically ingested water in the snorkel and caused a fire down in the boat. Everybody pretty much rejects that, and so there's really only 4 hypotheses that can come up. So hydrogen explosion coming off the batteries, had a collision with one of our boats. That's the Russians' favorite explanation. A missile explosion, interesting, or it was intentional or unintentionally scuttling of the crew. The crew scuttled the boat. So here's what the United States does. 8 March, the North American Air Defense Command, the satellites called they could see in IR. They saw heat plumes. They registered 2 heat plumes in the Pacific. Okay, but they don't do anything about it because it's there and it's gone. There's no continuation of like a missile track, right? So they think that's an anomaly. And then the U.S. Navy SOSUS, they figure out an isolated single sound of an explosion or implosion and, quote, a good-sized bang. That's some good analysis right there for you. We heard a good-sized bang. But where they correlate all this, it's 400 miles away from where the Russians are looking. Then, the University of Hawaii ship Terra 2 finds an oil slick. And they take a test, and it's radioactive. Odd. Radioactive oil slick off the coast, not that far away from the Hawaii. The deck logs now, the Office of Naval Intelligence engages. Deck logs are gone. The Terra 2 crew is interviewed, and they all sign confidentiality agreements. And so you can kind of see where the oil slick was compared to where they're supposed to be, right there. So the Defense Intelligence Agency assigns this really cool ship called the Halibut to operate what they called Operation Velvet Fist. By the way, I don't know how they come up with the names, okay? We get crazy names in the military. I don't know who in what office they said, hey, we're going to call this Operation Velvet Fist. Whatever. But the cool thing about the Halibut is it looks kind of weird, right? You see kind of how it looks like a not normal. It's got that thing on the back there. Well, it has what they call a bat cave in it. And it has little remote-controlled fish that they can steer around and go deep and go looking. They had already been involved. Anytime the Russians would fire off a missile and it would come plunking down in the ocean, they'd go pick it up. And so they get called in, and they spend from March until August, and they find it. And they took 22,000 pictures of this boat, like 5,000 meters deep, sitting on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And you can kind of see it, right? Like the pointer doesn't work on the LEDs, but you can kind of see, like up here on the right, like it's kind of laying on its side. You can kind of see the periscope coming off. There's a drawing that kind of shows what you should be looking at, right? Okay, and this is part of their report. It said, first view was a skeletal human face. Okay, that's disturbing. It was a corpse dressed in a sheepskin coat and a heavy storm boots came into focus. His cold weather gear indicated he was outside when the disaster occurred, which meant they were surfaced and he was on the conning tower on the sail. And he had ridden the sinking submarine down to the bottom of the ocean where his body was thrown clear of the wreckage. Compartments were torn open, allowing the fish to be maneuvered and get first-hand look at all the operations and crew remains. Russians don't know we're doing it. If they did, they'd be freaking out, okay, because we're messing with their sub. But that's what it looked like. There's some more pictures of it, and then this is kind of what the K-129 looked like, and then kind of what it looked like in ocean. These were all hand-drawn. So, the halibut goes down there, takes 22,000 photos. Bring them all back in, come back to Pearl Harbor in September. And this was the quote. Dr. John Craven, by the way, if you want to do some, like he's spooky. I mean, really spooky. Like, interesting, very smart man. His quote was, optimum recovery of significant intelligence information concerning the submarine, its mission, and its equipment. We milked the submarine dry of really meaningful information. In other words, even the submarine where it was split open in some places, they could put the fish in there. And what they figured out was it had taken on water before it reached crush depth. Because if it had not taken on water, it would have crushed like a can. But there was enough water in the sub that the pressure at the bottom of the Pacific couldn't crush it, which meant everything on the inside of that sub was fairly pristine, to include the guy that they found laying on the outside of it. And he's now briefing directly to President Johnson. So this is Lyndon Baines Johnson. He's getting briefed directly. And then the commander of the halibut, quote, Commander Clarence Moore was brought to the Oval Office for a strictly off-the-record ceremony. That was the Assistant for National Security. Like, he got to go in and sit with President Johnson in the Oval Office. And then the crew was all individually decorated to receive the President Unit citation, but when you go look for that citation, it's all redacted. And there was no ceremony for him. Normally, when you have a military ceremony, everybody comes in, you stand up, everybody, it's kind of a hoorah event. Every one of these guys was private and off the record. And then there was a defense intelligence estimate, which was a report, was created, but nobody can find it. So here's your question that remains from Dr. Craven from his autobiography. It says, the secret residing in the secret. The motivation of that Soviet captain and his crew had remained intact, and that, ironically, is the secret that ought to be revealed. In other words, what were they doing? Like, great, we found the ship, we found the missiles, we found all the stuff. Why were they were outside their patrol area? Why were they where they were? And what were they doing? Now, here's where it turns from strictly a naval intelligence kind of find, where we take lots of pictures and dig around and collect stuff, into something where it's politics. I talked about the four instruments of power, right? Diplomatic, intelligence, military, economic. Well, all of a sudden, now we're going to go from military and we're going to flip over into diplomatic. So in December of 1968, President Nixon, President Johnson didn't run. President Nixon is inaugurated, soon to be inaugurated. Henry Kissinger is named the National Security Advisor, and he gets all the DEIs, NIEs, which is a national intelligence estimate, and all the presidential daily briefs that the CIA sits down and has a talk every day. And here's Dr. Craven again. The discovery of a high probability that the Soviet submarine was some sort of rogue. In other words, captain's just doing what he wants with nuclear missiles. And that at the outset, the Soviets had no idea that its loss was not just an accident, so it wasn't just a boat that sank, was a situation made to order for Kissinger. So now Henry Kissinger, who is the national security advisor, takes this on. And now it becomes not just a missing boat, but we're going to wrestle between two major powers. And for some reason, several of those pictures that the USS Halibut had taken get leaked to the Russian D.C. embassy. They show up at the D.C. embassy. And all of a sudden, in 1969, Brezhnev, who is the premier of the Russians, the Soviet Union, starts consolidating all his political and military power. Like, all of that makes it back to the Soviet president. And they completely rewrite all of their procedures for nuclear weapons. Launch codes for the ballistic missiles are now held at the general staff. They're not at the operational units. They're completely removed out of the operational fleet. There's an additional code from the Soviet naval headquarters that they needed for fail-safe. So you had two people that would sit there and organize and be able to. So you had to have two people authorizing that launch. And the KGB was stripped of the role of physical custodian of all the nuclear warheads. The KGB was the one that took care of all the nukes. You had to check them out like a library from those guys. And it was given to the Soviet Red Army or the Navy or the Air Force. And in October of 1969, Nixon put the entire U.S. military on high nuke alert. We don't talk about that when we don't talk about the Cold War, but that was the reality of what was going on every day. In 1969, now don't do the math, I was 1. What did I care? If I ask my parents, they don't know anything about this because it just was going on in the background. They had other things that they had to take care of. And so, on July 1st of 1969, the Nixon administration created Project Azorian, and this is where it gets fun. It is absolutely the most audacious, expensive, clandestine project in history. The CIA is given complete control of it, and John Peragosky is the lead. Now, the Soviets called him Mysterious Mr. P, okay? But he knows what he's doing because he did the U-2 spy plane, which is all the way, and we're still flying those today, in 2 years. The A-12 Oxcart, which turned into the SR-71, again, fastest airplane ever created from design to first flight in about 2.5 years, and then that's a Corona satellite. The same thing that I talked about that was picking up the launch, he did that whole thing in 2 years. This guy is a whiz kid. And here's the mission that they're going to do. They're going to recover the wreckage, quote unquote. They don't call it a submarine, it's a target object. It weighs about 2,000 tons. They're going to go get it. It's sitting on the Pacific floor, 5,100 meters submerged, okay? And you're going to do it fast, in complete blackout and clandestine operation, and it's decided we're going to do a grunt lift. Now, that picture right there, the BBC did a documentary in the CIA museum, and that's in the CIA museum. What does that look like? Looks like K-129. Somebody knows what they're doing when they try to make a model to understand for mission planning, and it's sitting in the CIA mission or a museum. And grunt lift, what does that mean? Well, every time you go into Walmart and you walk past that thing, right, that has all the stuffed animals and there's this claw, that's a grunt lift, right? This thing, it's the same concept. This thing is going to come out of a ship, go down, grab the boat that weighs 2,000 tons, and lift it to the surface. And they hired this guy. Global Marine was selected. John Graham, genius, naval architect. And he actually developed the first ship, the Glomar Challenger, not the Glomar Explorer, this is a sister ship, and he invented a way for that ship to remain in perfect position. It wouldn't move with the heat. Like, if you know about SpaceX and the barges where the missiles come back and land, and you look out there, those things don't move. He invented it without GPS. And this is what it had to have. These are the requirements. I'm going to go through this pretty quick. has to have a dry, floodable center moon pool to house the claw and the artifact. What's the artifact? It's a submarine. But they won't call it a submarine. It's the artifact or target object, right? It has to have heavy lift pipe string. In other words, it's got to be 17,000. So these pipe strings, just like when you see on an oil rig, these pipe strings are going to go down 17,000 feet. And it has to have a full payload capacity to reach that thing back up of 4,250 tons. It's gimbaled. In other words, that thing has to be parked over that object and not move. Despite whatever the Pacific Ocean is doing, it can't move. And then it has to be able to lift 7,000 tons at 18 feet per minute. Anybody in engineering in here? We need to bring the engineers in here. That's incredible. We're talking moon launch kind of stuff. How incredible. Has to have a docking system. Okay? And it has to have a dynamic positioning system capable of holding hold the boat in place, and that's what they came up with. The artifact. Yeah. Not the submarine, the artifact. That's what they came up with. Okay? That's a real boat called the Glomar Explorer. And you see that moon pool? We're going to come to that in just a second. This thing is gargantuan. It's bigger than an aircraft carrier. And they're building it in plain sight. And nobody knows. Almost 190 meters long, 35 meters wide. It weighs 45,000 metric tons. This thing is gargantuan. It's greater than $350 million. I don't know where they got the money. Somebody printed it. That's about 1.68 bill today. Just for the boat. And it was never acknowledged, quote unquote, never acknowledged, but you can't see it, but this is the blueprints for it, right? That's the blueprints for it. That's the bay, the moon pool. That little circle right there, that's a dude waving. That's how big this thing is. And here's what's really interesting about it. It's hollow. The boat is hollow in the middle with no construction across it at all. So it's going to want to what? Collapse, right? It's too wide to get through the Panama Canal, so it sails from Chester, Pennsylvania to Long Beach, California with 178 crew members. That's a picture of it to the right. That's the ship. And here's the cover story. It's going to go mining nodules off the ocean floor. There's these nodules, they've known about them forever, that are like pure minerals, manganese, cobalt, nickel, whatever. And they're going to go down there and they're going to scoop them off the floor. And they're going to get this guy to do it. Now, this is Howard Hughes. Anybody know who Tony Stark is, right? Little Marvel action. I'm telling you, real live Tony Stark. He's about as eccentric as they come. The last picture he ever took was in 1956. He's much of a patriot, had supported the CIA before. His wealth when he died was around $55 billion in our dollars in 1976. And they stand up a CIA commercial operations division, and they do it all in plain sight. They're building a mining company, and he's doing it all from the top. He has a penthouse in the Desert Inn. That's where he lives. That's where his business office is. That's where he lives, in the top of the Desert Inn. But it's in the public. It's in the papers, right? San Francisco Chronicle reported on it, and the CIA is smart enough that they start sending people out to conferences and legal conferences and the UN and going, hey, this is what we're doing. We're mining nodules. Clementine, they had to invent Clementine, built by Lockheed. This giant claw. That's the one thing you can't explain, because you're not going to go down and pick up these nodules with a giant claw, right? That doesn't make any sense. So that had to be undercover. Lockheed builds it, and they build the largest floating dry dock ever. That's about the size of a football stadium right there. And they actually would leave out mining equipment around the dock to make it look like we were actually mining, but we were not. And that would submerge to go under the Glomar Explorer. So if you were trying to get anything into the ship without anybody knowing, that boat would go completely underwater, go under the Glomar Explorer. They would open the moon pool up and go up into it. Those are the gimbals. They were built in Germany. The That's what kept the ship from moving. And you can't have pipe hit the side of the boat, or it's going to it's like a tin can. It's going to rupture. There's some computers. There was 4 of them, 32 kilobytes, with cards. Now, I just blew anybody's mind in here. Like the people that are laughing are like, yeah, that's how it was. Like, you guys are like, it's a computer, no big deal, right? But at the time, that was cutting edge. And there it is. That's what it looks like. So the pipe would come up, they'd go down to those derricks. Either side of those derricks would lower the claw, and you got something that looked like that. It set sail on 20 June of 74, right? So this thing has been, from design to go, is like less than 3 years. It arrives over the target on 4 July 74, and it completes operations on 12 August. At the end, it was, when it set sail, it was given about a 10% shot of being successful. Now, 4 days before it's done, Nixon resigns. Right? This is why history is never one event in and of itself. It's a swirl. Remember I said we got to pull this apart, right? And so Ford becomes the president, and they don't write this thing down. It's only verbal. It's verbalized only in the Oval Office. And here's in his memoir, he writes, "I did not feel the Glomar action was a gamble. I was convinced we had to take the risk." It's a big risk, okay? So the question you got to ask is the juice worth the squeeze? Like, why are we going to all this effort, money, all that? What are we actually trying to get? So while they're out there, the Soviets start watching this, and they didn't think any of this was possible at all. Didn't think it was real. But they would send some missile tracking ships and trawlers and fishing trawlers, and then they would send what's called it's a KA Helix, that's a helicopter, to fly over the Glomar Explorer, right? And they would investigate, but they basically bought the cover story. And what was funny is they also sent, remember I talked about the Glomar Challenger, they sent that one out to confuse the Russians, right? To make it look like there was more than one boat out here. And they actually bought it. Admiral Shaitrov was an intelligence officer, and he admitted they got all sorts of confused. Now, I don't know how you confuse, because the one has 2 derricks and the other one has 1. Hey, but I'm not in the middle of the Pacific. So here it comes. There it is. The Claw has 12 TV cameras on Clementine. They never called it a Claw. They called it Clementine. It has 26 high-powered lights, and it has 3 sets of sonar, and it has all these little jets to move it, right? Because they have to steer it to get over the boat. And those are some of the pictures that come back that we have. What's interesting about it is that picture right there to the left is a ratfish. It's a blind fish. Nobody had ever seen one, but it swam into the screen. It swam into the vision. And the other thing on the right, so they used this crack in the hull as a way to kind of figure out where everything was at, to synchronize all their equipment. That's where you see the little cross hacks right there, and then they come across what is that? Well, it's a hammer. Well, they find out later that somebody that was on the ship 5,000 meters above had accidentally dropped a hammer into the moon pool, and it went straight down and landed on top of the submarine. But this is what they're going for. There's an intact Soviet ballistic missile submarine, intact Soviet ballistic missile right there. And I can't, it's really hard to see that, but that's basically the lid that would come off of the missile tube before it launched. So it's intact. So you can kind of see what it's looking at, right? There's the 3 tubes right there, right? And remember the bell, okay? Remember the bell. All right, so then 1,500 meters above the ocean floor, about midway through the process, they've successfully grabbed it. It's coming up, okay? And one of the hooks on the Claw fails under tension, built by Lockheed. Supposedly Lockheed and Glomar had fights and fights and fights. They had chosen this high-strength steel that didn't operate necessarily temperature-wise. It was brittle, and so it broke. Now, it was only one part of the Claw, because there was a whole claw there, but only one broke. The other ones didn't break, but one broke. And a large part of the K-129 fell back to the ocean floor. The CIA reports that as a complete failure. Now, they kind of want to go back for it, for Project Matador, because they failed to recover, their words, failed to recover missile and cryptological gear, but they admit to maybe recovering a torpedo and some other minor gear, but they never released the inventory of what they actually took off that ship. That's still classified 50 years later. There is one. That is a control panel that came off the 129 that's in the CIA museum that the BBC did a documentary on. So the Glomar Explorer offloads, and there's a pretty good picture. That's the floating barge I was showing you before, okay? Submerged the whole barge right below the ship, and they offloaded all the recovered material that they'd gotten to that barge, and then they immediately scrapped Clementine. There are no pictures of the claw at all that you can get, okay? It's gone. The Ford administration, the SecDef, who was James Schlesinger, interesting guy, said in a White House meeting, the operation is a marvel. Yeah. And there's some pretty good video and documentaries out there you can all go watch. They did recover some sailor remains. They were all highly radioactive, and they were ready for this. They, depending on what report you read, they recovered 6. There's another one out there that thinks it's more like 70. But they had a special burial at sea. Highly radioactive, obviously in horrible states of decay, 4 September of 74. But in October of 92, as the wall has come down, as the Cold War is ending, the CIA director, Robert Gates, goes and gives a video to the Russian President Yeltsin of that burial at sea. So they filmed the whole thing. It's all done in Russian. It's all done according to Russian standard. They knew that they were going to have to be prepared for that. And you can go online. It's about 14 minutes, and you can watch the whole thing. I don't know who hung it out there in the internet, but it's there. So if you want to go watch, you can look up the K-129 burial at sea. President Yeltsin, nobody knew what happened to the K-129 from the Russian perspective. He was moved emotionally, according to Gates. Then I'm going to read this. This is William Colby, who was the director of the CIA before Gates. Says the refloating itself was less than satisfactory. Okay, at a depth of 10,000 feet, the Glomar underwent some damage. The Soviet submarine itself was broken into 2 pieces. On the forepart, about 1/3 of the ship was eventually brought back to the surface, while the aft fell to the bottom of the sea with its nuclear missiles, its guiding apparatus, its transmission equipment, its codes. In other words, all the thing is very specific of what they didn't get. All the things the CIA had hoped to recover through this unprecedented operation. That was in his biography, his autobiography. But in September of 81, he was sued by the Reagan administration because he released all that information through a French publisher. It never went through the CIA. Okay? And he actually was fined $30,000 for breaking security protocol by releasing that classified information. Everything that he said there was classified. On 5 June of 74, then, the cover gets blown. We can't keep the cover on this thing anymore. There's a random robbery at the Hughes Summa Corporation that was described by the investigators that it was with an ease that astonished police investigators. Like, they couldn't believe, here you have the Hughes Corporation, they couldn't believe how easy these guys broke in. The investigators thought it had to be an inside job. The building's electrical alarm system was not working and it had been out of order for some time. This is a $1 billion company, by the way. The 4-man team held the single guard at gunpoint and used a 2-tank acetylene torch. They cracked a safe and a large vault, and then they fled with 2 footlockers of documents, $68,000 in cash, and then they called an attempted blackmail, of which the FBI, nobody considered that real, but then it hit the newspapers. In February of 75, now, a year after we brought this thing up, the headlines of the Los Angeles Times and national television had it all wrong, generally, right? They had a wrong code name. They thought it was in the Atlantic Ocean, but the New York Times got it right. Seymour Hersh had been following it since 1973, and the CIA director had told him, please don't publish that. Let us get this done. Really interesting. So he didn't. But the cover is now blown. It's out. And as a result, full stop. They don't go do Project Matador. They don't continue on with the recovery at all. And from 1975 to 2011, the CIA doesn't say a word. They don't talk about it at all. Nothing. In 2011, the official CIA history of Project Azorian was released, heavily redacted. But in 2015, then, the Glomar Explorer was scrapped. Now, this is interesting. In the book, Rising Tide, you have the official story. This guy is a guy by the name of Walter Boyne, who's an Air Force officer, intel officer that ran part of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and retrieved the Globus encrypted communication system, as well as the Akula system, cryptological equipment that could send and receive high-speed encrypted radio transmissions. Alternate theory. We got it. And after a year after that, we were able to break all the Soviet communications for a year after we had recovered the target object. And then in 1989, the area where the barge had parked after it had mated with the Glomar Explorer ended up having to be added to the Superfund site due to the radioactivity. So in August of 93, and I'm going to try to speed up here just a little bit, there's this interesting thing. The Cold War has thawed, and now we're trying to do this joint accounting of missing persons, of which all the sailors from K-129 are on the list. And the Russian, there's who represented us, but they don't get along. Very bitter. The Russians want to know where their sailors are at. What do you know? We want to know where people are from Vietnam. What do you know? And to smooth things over, on the 7th time they met, Ambassador Toon returned the K-129's brass bell to him and a crewman's camera that had belonged to a crewman that they had recovered. Now you remember, I can't use my laser. Do you see where the bell is? Right there? That was part of the area that had broken away and gone back to the bottom of the Pacific. But we have the bell. That sends all sorts of craziness everywhere. And the Russians at that point are convinced that what we've got is way more than what we've ever said. And so there's all these requests, we call it FOIA requests, right? Freedom of Information Act. Everybody wants to know what happened. And so the CIA comes up with, the United States has issued no official comment on the matters related to the vessel Glomar Explorer. It is the policy of this government. Here it is. You wanted to know where it started. Not to confirm or deny. So whenever you hear from a CIA perspective, like we can neither confirm nor deny, that's the first time that ever worked. And it stands up to federal court scrutiny and it's used today. So anytime you try to FOIA request, like a newspaper person or a historian tries to get something from the CIA, their response is, I can neither confirm nor deny. This is the curator of the CIA Museum. His quote was, I encourage skepticism of the details surrounding the project's ostensible failure. The conventional wisdom has become that it was a failed mission. The CIA has allowed that belief to be what everyone understands, but why would they not? I always say we have no idea what they got. So, at this point, once we return the bell, the Russians posthumously award all 98 crew members, all 98, the Medal of Courage. There's a stone memorial erected near the home port, and Captain Peter Hutchhausen was our naval attaché. His quote was, talking to a fellow captain, Captain, you're very young and inexperienced, but you will learn that there are some things both sides have agreed not to address. And one is that event, the Scorpion, we'll talk about that, and our K-129 loss for similar reasons. So we don't talk, it's like the secret that we're just not going to talk about this. So, the last quote, Captain Jack Newman was on the Glomar Explorer. He was in the moon pool. He was there when we started taking stuff apart. It says, near the end of Project Azorian's disassembly of the K-129's retrieved remains, there was one large air flask on the Hughes Glomar Explorer's well deck that evidenced a faint crack about 4 feet long out of its 10-foot length. Cutting the cylinder open, to our utter amazement, we found a hardbound book, completely intact and undamaged. The title of this book that had miraculously survived, a book that had belonged to a sailor who had perished in the service of our Cold War enemy was Short Stories of the American West, Cowboys and Indians. So, we're back now to Tom Clancy. The difference between fiction and reality? Fiction has to make sense. Okay, so when we start pulling this apart, when you start doing the analysis on this, there's no good answer. This whole thing is still shrouded in Cold War secrecy 50 years later. You can make your own assessments based on the facts that I gave you. I personally, I think K-129 was the real Red October. I think that it wasn't just an accident. But Red October is a fiction. It's fiction. It's Tom Clancy's dream, right? K-121, not. The guys that were serving on the USS Barb, real people. Real people out there serving that we'll never know, and they just serve in an unknown way, and they probably like it that way. Also, there's some history that's more important than others. I've said this a lot. The history of the pencil. I like pencils. Okay? It's not as important as this history. We've already talked. Nobody talks about the Cold War at all. How close we actually came to annihilating each other. Hair's width of actually throwing nukes at one another. That's important history to know. But when you start talking about events and you start talking about classification, history is slippery, okay? You're trying to coalesce facts and perspectives and agendas, and then you got these higher order effects. Like, I'm quite certain nobody in the United States is excited to have the Russians know that we have a completely intact, if we do, a completely intact submarine at a harbor in California. And really, what's interesting about all this is you can determine a lot more by people's actions or lack of actions than their words. And again, I already mentioned this, but real people, quiet, unknown people are out there sacrificing to defend freedom, understanding, gathering intelligence to understand what the motives and capabilities and intentions of enemies really are. Hey, everybody, we just had an Afghani national arrested in Oklahoma this week. Well, that didn't happen because he walked into a police station and turned himself in. Those are real people out there doing some hairy work to make sure that we stay safe. And then, again, their legacy is our responsibility. We need to keep this legacy alive. If we don't know it, and we don't teach it, it just goes away. And there's more lessons and inspiration out there. I mean, this is just one. And this one, I mean, we did it in an hour. There's a lot more. And so if you go out and Google it, start digging in, watch a couple videos, it's pretty interesting. Those are the books that covered this. Tell your engineering buddies that the one by Josh Dean is phenomenal from an engineering perspective, like how they engineered that boat and all the equipment and the claw and how they did all that and did it in 2.5 years. Absolutely incredible. Okay, that is the real Red October. Questions? Give me some questions. I've just sat here and dumped, like verbally assaulted you now for like an hour. What do you think? Oh, thanks.
How did you choose this topic? What made you think of it?
Okay. The question was, why did I choose this topic, and why did I think of this? It's actually an interesting answer. Number one, Matt McCook's class is teaching part of Cold War right now this semester, right? So they're talking Cold War. So I was like, hey, we should come up with some Cold War something. And then second, Mary, my youngest daughter, had never seen The Hunt for Red October, and she wanted to watch it. And so I was like, I'm going to do some research on Hunt for October. And then you start picking at this, and then there's a lot. And this is one of those that the more you pull on that string, the more there is. It's just more and more and more. And so that's where we went. And it's the 50th anniversary of the recovery of the target object.
But as
As far as I know from my research, the Soviets never went back, and they wouldn't know where to go to. So there's not like a historical marker out there that goes, hey, here is the K-129. We left some transponders there when we brought the thing out, like the halibut, when the halibut left, so we could find it again. But after that, they pulled all that up. And what's really interesting about the conversation then is when they pulled the whole thing up and it broke apart, when it went down, it shattered into a million pieces. It's all over the floor. You can't find anything. Everything's small, right? And as they were coming back to port, the stuff that they didn't want, like they recovered things like mattresses out into the ocean. Weighted it down, throw it in the ocean, let it sink. So there's really nothing there. If there is something there, it's irrecoverable because it's so small. But my guess is there's probably very little there to start from. Sir?
Was there any concern that, any of these nukes were undetonated and you're about to retrieve it, pull it up, or just threatening to blow up the
Yeah.
Azoria?
So the question is about the nukes that were on board. They were what they think happened was two of the missiles, either they had a fuel leak and they blew up, or they tried to do an unauthorized launch because nobody's ever explained the 11 people that joined. They're mystery men, right? There's one guy that thinks they were KGB and actually took over the boat, and there was this plan that was hatched. I don't know. Nukes are interesting in the fact that they're hard to have go off. So they were ready for all the radioactivity on it, but they weren't concerned about, like, from an unexploded ordnance perspective. They're actually fairly easy to disarm from a perspective, right? Because you have to have very specific conditions for that to go off. So they felt that they could recover the missiles, the torpedoes, de-arm them. What they were more worried about is the missiles that did go off, that cooked off inside the tube, had spread, the material itself, it didn't go nuclear, but it was all radioactive and it spread throughout the ship. So when they're pulling people up, like remains, they're all radioactive. And so the people that were on the Glomar Explorer had practiced for that, right? They had practiced for that. Sir.
Great. Thank you, by the way.
You're welcome.
Cool. My first job was actually at Hughes Electronics. There's a lot of cool history there around. My first boss started out as a young engineer there, and during model rocketry lunchtime, Howard Hughes came out and met them. So he had that connection and was he hadn't become a recluse yet.
Yeah, Howard. There's a whole other story for you in Howard Hughes.
So my question though is, you showed the operating box. Why do you think the sub was not where it was supposed to be? And is there any thoughts on, was it going somewhere? I mean, you read the book. So
Sure. So there is no consensus around the books as to what it was doing. So that was a normal patrol box. That's where in theory, right, the Soviets would have them go there because that's where they were looking to find when they didn't report in. So from the Russian Navy and Air Force perspective, they were going to where they thought the sub was. We don't know what their orders were to go somewhere else. And so when you tie that to the oil slick, they were outside their patrol box, probably either under orders that they had unsealed after they were afloat, or the boat had been taken over by these 11 people and everybody that had been there. There's some reports that they found a large amount of people that were in the forward bay in not places they should be. And so that these 11 people had taken the boat over intending to do a rogue launch on Pearl. And then it failed. Now, here's the interesting thing, right? This is where you have this perspective and this over here, and truth, when you get into this world, is probably somewhere in the middle, right? Like Venn diagram, right? But again, most of the people that were either responsible for that program or participated in it, they're not here anymore. So you got to depend on, are they Are they telling the truth in their autobiography? I think William Colby, when he got fined, why would a CIA director send his autobiography to a French publisher? That's ridiculous. And why would he knew what all the rules were. Why would he skip past it? I think that was his way of putting out another statement that we didn't get any of this. That was his way of getting it on the record that we didn't get anything that we wanted. Because remember, if we had gotten that whole boat up, that's kind of like throwdown. That's go to war kind of stuff. So I think that was his way of putting out a press release without putting out a press release. And they fined him $30,000 for a national security violation of that level. Please. I think the publisher probably paid for that, right? So and Colby's the same guy that then went to all the newspapers and were like, hey, shh, don't do that. Don't publish that. Don't publish that. Don't publish that. And they were like, well, he goes, if it's about to break, I'll call you. So he had an agreement with the New York Times that if this thing was going to, if he couldn't stop the story from coming out, that he was going to call the newspaper and let him get the scoop. Okay, what else? We're a little over. Yes?
Kind of more of a random question, but I wasn't sure based on what you were saying. So when you said that the sub was supposedly off course and it was found away from where it should have been, was it found more north of where it should have been or more south of where it should have been?
Good question. So the question is where was it located? It was actually found further southeast than where it should have been. We have no idea what their orders were. The only reason that we're guessing is that the patrol box is where the Russians, the Soviets, had said they had put patrols in the past. And we saw that that's where your missile boat goes. That SOSUS network we talk about, right? It's hearing all the underwater activity. That's where they had gone in the past. So they're totally guessing that is where it should have been, but that's where they had always gone in the past. And so now it wasn't there. That's a good question. All right. Any other questions? I'll hang out down here if anybody wants to talk about this a little bit. Lydia, give me a number.
14.
Anybody? Who's on the list? 14. Hey! Oh, good catch. All right. Now this one is a Tilvahala one, but it's big. It's a big T-shirt. I don't know. What do you got? All right. Here you go. I need to have a T-shirt cannon. That'd be more fun. All right, last T-shirt. Nick Wood. All right. Last one for the hat. Hey, awesome. Listen, last pitch. Yes, sir. Any discipline without a purpose is drudgery. Any discipline, math, piano, history, any discipline without a purpose is drudgery, okay? And you won't keep at it. But your history has a purpose. You get to understand more about yourself. It's an understanding of human nature. You understand more about the events that brought you here. So take a moment to understand the purpose of your history, and it won't be so hard because there's more to be discovered. Thank you. You guys have been awesome. I'll hang out down here if anybody has any questions.